Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. This is a really important workshop, and I'm glad that you have made the time to be here. My name is Lori Wilson. I'm a news anchor with WSB-TV in Atlanta, Georgia. Clearly in Georgia, we have made plenty of headlines recently as it relates to law enforcement and our state, as well as our leadership in the state. What we'd like to do is go ahead and start with a word from our sponsor, Motorola Solutions Incorporated.
Thank you, Lori. Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to take a few minutes to welcome all the attendees participating in this monumental training. And on behalf of the almost 20,000 Motorola Solutions employees across the globe, I'd love to extend a very hearty congratulations to Noble for 45 years. I've been a member of Noble for many years, and as a first assistant chief, recently retired from Detroit after 25 years. The benefits are incredible. These training sessions matter. I also understand the importance of not just sponsorship, but partnership. And Motorola Solutions continuously works to provide the solutions like our Command Central and end-to-end suite from cause to case closures to help keep officers safe, but also increase accuracy and data that will ultimately help law enforcement rebuild trust and empower the communities that they serve. Again, welcome to everyone attending today, and congratulations, Noble, again on 45 incredible years. Thanks, Lori.
Ms. Lashenda Stair, thank you so much for Motorola. We certainly appreciate your comments. Probably if I had a Motorola device right now, things would be much more smooth than they are right now.
I'm sure.
We're going to go ahead, though, and get things rolling. Again, we've got a distinguished panel of guests, so I want to go ahead and start with those introductions of our panelists. And then I'm going to ask each panelist to make some opening remarks. If we can keep those down to a minute, I'd appreciate it, but we'll go ahead and get started right now. I've got a lot, as I said, to get through. These are very accomplished panelists. New York State Attorney General Letitia Tish James is the 67th Attorney General for the state of New York. With decades of work, she's an experienced attorney in public service with a long record of accomplishments. She's the first woman of color to hold statewide office in New York and the first woman to be elected Attorney General. In 2013, Ms. James was elected public advocate for the city of New York and became the first woman of color to hold citywide office. As public advocate, Ms. James served as a watchdog over New York City government agencies and as an advocate for the city's most vulnerable communities. She transformed the public advocate's office to be a formidable engine for change. Her office handled over 32,000 constituent complaints and passed more legislation than all previous public advocates combined, including a groundbreaking law that banned questions about salary history from the employment process to address the pervasive gender wage gap. That is obviously still an issue we're dealing a lot with these days. Ms. James successfully took on the gun industry by pushing New York City's largest pension fund to divest from gun and ammunition retailers. She fought in court on behalf of children and families on issues including children in foster care, children with disabilities, and tenant protection. New Yorkers overwhelmingly elected Ms. James to a second term as public advocate in November of 2017. Before her election, she actually served on the city council as well. Prior to serving as a public advocate, she represented the 35th district in Brooklyn. She has, again, a distinguished history and background. And for those of you who are looking online, I want you to go ahead and finish reading about her, but I want to go ahead and get out of the way because I know we have short time with her this afternoon. So I'll ask her for opening comments in just a bit. Attorney General Kwame Raul. Attorney General Kwame Raul, Democrat, sworn in as the 42nd Attorney General of Illinois in January 2019, born in Chicago to Haitian immigrants. Raul brings a lifetime of legal and policy experience, advocacy, and public service to the Office of Attorney General. As the state's chief legal and law enforcement officer, Attorney General Raul has demonstrated a commitment to protecting Illinois residents by leading the People's Law Firm. He's initiated efforts to provide aid to those impacted by violence, defend the rights of workers, and protect consumers from scams, especially throughout the COVID-19 global pandemic. Attorney General Raul has worked to reduce the long-lasting effects of violence and provide support to survivors of violent crime and their families. In the first 2 years of his administration, he improved Illinois crime victims' compensation program by ensuring that the process is trauma-informed, implementing efficiencies in the application process and increasing awareness of the program through outreach to communities across the state that are affected by violence. I ask that you please read more about him as well. And finally, I would like to introduce Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison. Keith Ellison was sworn in as Minnesota's 30th Attorney General on January 7th, 2019. Wow. It's obviously dealt with a lot since then. As the people's lawyer, Attorney General Ellison's job is to help Minnesotans afford their lives and their life with dignity, safety, and respect. His guiding values are generosity and inclusion. From 2007 to 2019, Keith Ellison represented Minnesota's 5th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he championed consumer, worker, environmental, and civil and human rights protections for all in Minnesota. He served for 12 years on the House Financial Services Committee, where he helped oversee the financial services industry, the housing industry, Wall Street, among others. Again, another very distinguished guest. I can't wait to get to the questions. So I want to go ahead and at this point, I'd like to open the floor for Ms. Letitia James, the State Attorney General there in New York, to go ahead and make your opening comments, if you will.
So good afternoon, and thank you, Lori, for that introduction. And I have to apologize. I have a press event in a few minutes, and I can only give opening remarks. And I'm going to then turn it over to my colleagues and to my brothers, Attorney General Kwame Raul and Minnesota State Attorney General Keith Ellison. So since its inception, for 45 years, Noble has been doing the hard work associated with building trust within our communities and being innovative about our approach to public safety. And this year, we've experienced quite a year as it relates to today's topic. The people are in desperate need of a criminal justice system that cares about maintaining its integrity and serving the people more than it cares about maintaining the status quo. And it's unfortunate that we have seen too many Americans, particularly Americans of color, continue to be arrested, incarcerated, and die by those who have been sworn to protect them. Accountability is simply not there. The laws in our country are not made to protect the civilian, and they are not made to protect the law enforcement officer either. Because when a civilian dies in police custody, it's often a policy failure in real action and in real time. An officer responding to a mental health crisis that they are not trained to deal with. And to be quite honest with you, we just put too many responsibilities on the backs of law enforcement officers. A civilian with a mental health crisis not getting the medical care that they need and deserve. And as the Attorney General of the state of New York that now has jurisdiction over all deaths as a result of law enforcement, I've seen countless number of individuals in the throes of mental illness unfortunately die at the hands of officers who unfortunately are poorly trained to deal with those who are struggling. An officer using excessive force because the focus of their training hasn't been de-escalation. It hasn't been communication. It hasn't been time. It hasn't been space. When an officer steps in to check a fellow officer, it should be seen as an assistance instead of betrayal. And unfortunately, they are not trained to get involved and to basically respond to any of their law enforcement brothers and sisters who unfortunately intend to engage in excessive force. The use of excessive force can kickstart a chain of events that can spiral out of control very quickly and should only be used in the most extreme of circumstances where de-escalation tactics and techniques have failed. Between, again, excessive force, which, as I mentioned, can kickstart a chain of events, the adrenaline that flows from that. And oftentimes what needs is time and space and the ability of individuals to intervene, because this protects both the civilian and the officer. But as the laws stand now, there is no clear definition available, no clear definition to guide police forces so that they can train officers to respond instead of react. But as the laws stand now, the use of force is pretty much always always justified. And when you tell someone that they can use a hammer whenever they feel it is necessary, every problem starts to inevitably look like a nail. And that is why in New York, I introduced the Police Accountability Act this spring to better define the justification for the use of force. And the goal of that bill is simple: to preserve lives by making sure that under the law, lethal force is an officer's last resort. And that also includes a real focus on training so that officers know how to react in situations where de-escalation is possible. To be clear, this would not change those split-second decisions that officers must make when confronted with a dangerous situation or when their life or someone else's life is being threatened. And there are reasonable protections that officers need in many situations, and that's critical. Officers are put in danger when they are forced to respond to situations where they are not trained or equipped to handle. And it's a disservice to everyone when people skate over that reality. In addition to better defining this area of policing, we also need more representative police forces, not only in New York, but all across this nation. When police units look like the communities they serve, there's more trust, more faith, more understanding, and better results. We also need more transparency in police forces all across the state of New York. Transparency is a great disinfectant, and it's important that individuals understand that law enforcement, just like elected officials, we are there to serve and not to be served. And we need to democratize our police units so that they respond more to the public. And so it's important, again, that we have more diversity, more transparency, more accountability in every rank of police forces, especially in key leadership positions. Accountability is key. Actions matter. Consequences matter. And oftentimes officers hold the difference between life and death in their hands. I thank you so much. I unfortunately have to leave. And again, I turn it over to my two brothers who I know who are dynamic speakers and will lead this discussion. Thank you so much.
And Ms. James, we so appreciate that. Thank you so much for your time. I'm a journalist, but I will say the Eric Garner case was the case that broke my heart. And he was George Floyd. Before there was a George Floyd, there was an Eric Garner. And you talk about those split-second decisions. This was not that.
Right.
We also have with you kind of the celebrity angle because of the high profile case that you're taking on with the former president. You talk about accountability. Can you, just before you go, talk to us about the enormous pressure? We've watched you across the country, whether we are familiar with New York or not. We've watched you around the country, the enormous pressure of really the integrity and maintaining that of your office when there's so many people that have their hands in the pot.
So let me just say, one, I've got an incredible team of professionals that serve the public each and every day. We go to work, we put our heads down, and we allow the chips to fall where they may. And two, the pressure that I have on my shoulders is no comparison to the pressures that New Yorkers and Americans face each and every day. I think about those who are facing eviction at a time of this pandemic. I think about all of those who are struggling to make ends meet, all of those who are losing their jobs. It's no comparison to the pressure that these individuals face. I am here because I have the opportunity to serve and because I've been given this position. But again, there is no pressure as long as you do the right thing, and as long as you respond to the needs of the citizens that you are protecting, and you recognize that you're here to serve and that you've got a job to do. A lot of individuals say, well, how do you deal with all of the pressure each and every day? Well, I am a woman of faith, and I have been trained as a proud graduate of Howard University to be an agent of change, and to make sure that it's really all about serving others and not serving myself, and about recognizing that no one individual, no corporation, no matter how powerful they are, that no one is above the law.
Well, just know you have a legion of people just behind you rooting for your support, no matter how things shake out. We definitely support you and appreciate the work that you're doing. So keep up the good work. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson.
Take care. I'm going to now turn things over to Attorney General Kwame Raul, and I'm going to let people who are much more better at technology than I am to go ahead and invite him to make comments, please.
Well, thank you. And I thank you and I thank you not. It's always difficult to follow Tish James, but I'll make my best attempt at it. Thank you for having me. I'm actually speaking to you from the police department in Aurora, Illinois, where the governor just signed a bill, a comprehensive bill to deal with gun violence here in the state of Illinois. So I had to run from there to here, but I'll be brief in my opening remarks. I started my career as a state's attorney, as a member of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, as a local prosecutor. However, I can't say that was my first interaction with law enforcement, being part of a law enforcement agency. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. Last year, towards the beginning of the pandemic, a friend of mine posted on Facebook, how old were you when a police officer first pointed a gun at you? It was surprising how many people were able to respond to it, including myself, which I responded 17 the first time, 19 the second time. Not because I was engaged in criminal activity, but because there were biases and unconstitutional policing that existed within the city of Chicago. I bring those experiences as a young Black man, having been raised on the south side of Chicago, to my role as part of law enforcement today and historically in my career. As a legislator, I worked on law enforcement reform legislation some 6 years ago that created body cam protocol requirements for use of force training, making sure we had a database such that police departments didn't hire an officer that was fired or resigned while under investigation from another police department. When I started as Attorney General some 2.5 years ago, I knew that I was going to continue my role in some way of engaging in law enforcement reform. Little did I know that less than a week into my tenure, I'd have a case put on my lap involving the murder of Laquan McDonald, and what I was faced with regards to what we believed was an illegal sentence of the officer that murdered Laquan McDonald. Officer Jason Van Dyke was sentenced on the lesser of the two crimes that he was convicted of. And so we filed a petition of writ of mandamus to the Supreme Court asking to overturn that sentencing and to have the appropriate sentencing. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court did not entertain our petition, which I think was a travesty of justice. But it wasn't but 5 days into my tenure as Attorney General that I was met with the fact that my role that I embrace as a legislator, working on law enforcement reform, trying to restore trust in law enforcement, working hand in hand with Noble, by the way, our chapter here in Illinois, would have to continue, and it has continued during the tenure, which I guess we'll be able to talk about in response to questions. So I'll cut it off there.
And that Laquan McDonald case, again, another case that drew national headlines and was heartbreaking for any mother of a son. I have to tell you, my family, I've got 2 police officers that are with Cook County. So I appreciate the challenges and complexities because we're watching what you do with a microscope. I want to ask just one question before I let you go, and then we go to Mr. Ellison, we've gotten some questions here from people who are watching the panel, and I just want to ask you about excessive force. Is that, the question is that a product of poor police training, or are there other contributing factors? And do you have any numbers as far as the number of police encounters that end in excessive force? You may not have that information readily available, but can you shed some light on that for us?
Yeah, and so certainly training is a component. It's not the sole component. Training or lack thereof, or inadequate training is a component of their existing the existence of excessive use of force, certainly in the state of Illinois, but throughout the nation, and police departments throughout the nation. However, one of the things that I think that I consistently say is a huge contributing factor is tolerance. If there's tolerance for excessive force, the envelope gets pushed further and further. And what's acceptable, both by way of training, by the way, as well as by way of disciplinary tribunals, the envelope gets pushed further and further down the line, and we've seen a lot of tolerance. I engaged law enforcement partners last year, and we met over the course of 25 meetings to work on police licensing within the state of Illinois. Prior to this past January, when we finally passed a bill in the legislature, the only way you would be decertified as a police officer in the state of Illinois is if you were convicted of a felony and maybe a couple of misdemeanors. We enhanced that with the certification bill that was negotiated with law enforcement at the table, with Noble at the table. I have to shout out to Chief Mitch Davis, who's the current president of the Chief of Police Association of the State of Illinois. His presence at the table during those negotiations was critical, because as a chief law enforcement officer, and me as a chief law enforcement officer of the state, and having the head of the state of police at the table and the sheriffs at the table, this wasn't something that was perceived as being anti-law enforcement. It was professionalizing law enforcement to restore trust. And so we were able to pass that. The governor has signed it. And so we're going to have a more robust certification process. So in addition to training, if there's use of excessive force, there's consequence. You can train as much as you want. You can have appropriate training, but if you don't have consequence if we didn't have Keith Ellison in Minnesota to step up to the plate and prosecute the way he did with integrity and with a very sensitivity to the sensitive nature of prosecuting a law enforcement officer. If we didn't have that consequence, then these acts can continue and continue, notwithstanding training.
And I know we only have you for a bit, but hopefully I'll get one more question in before you have to hop
we have a little
off.
time yet. Yeah.
Okay. And then at this time, I'd like to bring in Keith Ellison, again, Minnesota's 30th Attorney General, who was sworn in a little more than a year before the world came to know George Floyd. Please, I yield the floor to you to make some opening comments. Hopefully we've got him. Because if not, Kwame's stuck. He's in trouble. I'm going to go ahead and go back to him with questions. Let me know if anyone can, whether it is via text. Oh, I have to ask you to unmute if I could, Mr. Ellison. I don't know if you've got someone there who can help you unmute. You are muted right now.
Yeah, hello. This
There
is
we
Keith.
go.
Yeah, so thanks. I'm really pleased to be on here with my friends Kwame, Raul, and Tish James. You know, a year before George Floyd was killed, myself, together with former chief of police and current commissioner of public safety, John Harrington, a black police officer of many years, whose father was a black police officer in Chicago, by the way, Kwame. He and I joined up and we led a task force called Reducing Deadly Force Encounters with Police. I raise this point because our office got a lot of public attention through the prosecution of Derek Chauvin and the upcoming prosecutions of several other officers, the three others who were involved, plus the Dante Rice case. But we were working on this a year before, trying to prevent and reduce deadly force encounters with police, where we had law enforcement members on. We had our chief, Madera Arredondo, another black police officer, who sued the Minneapolis Police Department for racial discrimination, by the way, before he was ever the chief. And so we were trying to work on these issues. And I think attorneys general and members of Noble and law enforcement can work together to talk about preventing cases so that we never are in a situation where we have to prosecute anyone. Just prevent the case in the first place. The other thing I'd say is that while training is important, and I absolutely agree with Kwame, enforcement is also important. And you can write all the best training material you want, but when people break the rules, if nothing ever happens, then that remains a problem and you will not get compliant behavior. Let me take, for example, Carrie L. Horn, black female police officer in the city of Buffalo 15 years ago. Her colleague, a white male, is using what she believed was excessive force against a suspect. She intervenes to say, hey, stop it, we got this. He punches her in the face, which is an assault and a crime, and then proceeds to later on say that she interfered with his lawful arrest. What does she get for her trouble? Fired. And she has to fight for her pension. And if it weren't for a couple of black lawyers at Harvard who went well above and beyond the call of duty to get her pension restored, Carrie O'Horn, for intervening, as is her job, she would have got punched in the face and fired from her job and lost her pension. Carrie O'Horn, black female police officer, Buffalo, New York, who intervened and did the right thing and suffered for it. Why stop there? You know, I believe that I was just in Cleveland just yesterday. There, Tamir Rice, a kid gets killed by playing with a toy gun within 2 minutes of the officer exiting the vehicle. The kid didn't brandish the gun, and the caller said it might be a toy. That didn't stop this officer. This officer got to kind of kill this child. What do we know about this officer? This officer had been ruled to be unfit by a previous police department. Think about that. This guy commits a murder of a child, which he's never held accountable for, and yet another department said this man cannot be in our ranks. That's pretty compelling stuff. Kwame mentioned before a registry to say, look, if you're not good enough for Department X, you ain't good enough for Department Y. Don't try to run around all over just signing up one place where your colleagues have already spat you out as unfit. We need to make sure that doesn't happen. And then let me just finish by using the example that it is great that Officer Jason Van Dyke was criminally prosecuted. It's even better that the Attorney General demanded that there be a fair sentence, even though the Illinois Supreme Court didn't listen. But it took 4 years for Jason Van Dyke to be held accountable for murdering Laquan McDonald. Why so long? I mean, how many shots was it, Kwame? Like 19 or 26 or some crazy number?
16.
16. So I'll just wrap up by saying that that it is Black police officers who have been protecting community, who have stood up to try to stand for civil and human rights. I think that it is very important to point out one statistical fact, Lori, which is that Black and Hispanic police officers tend to stop, arrest, and use force against civilians less often than white officers do, and female officers of all races use less force than male colleagues do, a new case study out of the Chicago Police Department suggests. So the fact is, diversifying departments definitely helps. Promoting excellent officers of color helps. Promoting women helps. Holding people accountable for the rules also helps. The last point I want to make before I hand it to you: when Derek Chauvin basically tortured George Floyd to death, 14 officers wrote an open letter saying that we are not with this. This is wrong. We don't condone it. It is absolutely unacceptable. I don't say it's not police versus community. It's criminals who happen to get on the force versus all the rest of us, including officers who want to uphold the law, which is what most officers went to the department to do. So those are just a few framing comments. I look forward to the questions.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, I have 3 nephews who are police officers, and I think you're exactly right. Sometimes we end up politicizing this community against the police. This particular group is against the police, when that is not the case at all. Instead, it is all of us.
Line.
That's not it. That's
the
not
line
it.
is not police versus community. The line is people who probably never should have been cops in the first place versus everybody else. I mean, we have one officer in Minneapolis who shot and nearly killed an undercover police officer. And the fact that officer was an Asian man, a Hmong person, probably is what, I mean, this same officer that I'm referring to shot when I was a civil rights lawyer, shot my client in the back, and somehow, we sued him. And then he turns around and shoots Dewey No, a Hmong police officer who ends up committing suicide because he just couldn't face the world given the physical and emotional tragedy he suffered. I'll stop right there.
Which is where that idea of the registry, making sure that every department is aware of who's applying for a job,
right,
makes such a difference. I want to bring this question from the audience. It's in response to part of what you said. It says, look, officers are facing issues with compliance because offenders are not facing consequences for wrongdoing. That argument goes both ways. It seems as if there is an overall lack of accountability for criminality. Is it justice if we only seek justice for one group when clearly there's an overall problem with the criminal justice system? I'm going to give that to you.
Yeah, if I can.
Kwame, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think we get into this false dichotomy that if you're for law enforcement reforming our systems to lead to constitutional police, and that you're somehow soft on street criminals, right? That you're a proponent of letting folks off. The reality is, to the extent that you professionalize law enforcement, you rebuild trust between the public and law enforcement. You can hold more of those bad actors in the street accountable because you have the collaboration of community to help law enforcement. Right now, I can tell you in the city of Chicago, there's a huge level of distrust, and unless you restore that, we got a vicious crime going on in the streets of Chicago. We get mass shootings every weekend, I certainly, as I stepped up to the mic moments ago here in this building, talking about the efforts we are collectively doing as law enforcement agencies to confront gun violence. Yeah, I'm putting a lot of energies towards that, but I'm also, at the same time, I could walk and chew gum. I also recognize there's over 100-year history of unconstitutional policing from the Chicago Police Department. And if we're going to do something about the gun violence in the streets of Chicago, we're going to need community, and we're going to need a police department which community trusts. So we're in the midst of implementation of a consent decree that grew about as a result of an investigation initially initiated by Loretta Lynch when she was Attorney General, and taken over by my predecessor, Lisa Madigan, when Jeff Sessions stepped away from it once Trump came in, and passed on to me. We started the implementation of the consent decree 2 months into my term as Attorney General. It's a critical thing that's going on here, that not only for the city of Chicago, but I think for the nation. If we're successful with this implementation of the consent decree, it's a type of reform that can truly restore trust, that could put in policies and could be a case study for the entire nation. And I'll just add this, Tish, James and I led a letter, and Keith was involved in advocating his former colleagues in Congress to include in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act authority given to state attorneys general to conduct patterns and practice investigations. That's not done because we're trying to undermine our law enforcement partners and trying to do their work with regards to day-to-day criminal activity. We're trying to bolster it. You bolster it by creating professionalized policing that the public can trust and public can cooperate with. That's the goal.
Yeah. I was going to say, I mean, if you have a lack of trust within the public of police, I would think that would be really challenging as an officer to keep morale up. If every time I'm walking down the street, I've got somebody, looking at me the wrong way. Or do you know, like, I think morale has to be okay within officers. They have to be proud of the job that they do. And I think part of that comes with the community saying, thanks for what you do.
Yeah. Yeah, let me be clear. It most certainly, with the level of protest we had on the heels of the murder of George Floyd throughout the nation, it's a very, very difficult time to be a police officer. And there's some unfair blanket criticism that goes towards police officers. That's undeniably true. But we've got to understand where that came from. It came from decades, of tolerance for bad conduct, and that doesn't justify the type of things that we've seen with regards to looting, setting police cars on fire, violence towards police officers. That's criminal activity where those people need to be held accountable, as well as the people that I think the questioner was asking about having consequences for people who are committing bad acts towards community. Oftentimes when you talk about police reform, people say, what about black on black crime? Well, we can deal with both. We must deal with both. It's a false dichotomy to say, well, if you focus on law enforcement reform, you can't focus on crime within the community.
Let me ask this to both of you. This is a question from the audience. How do we empower police officers to stand up against and speak out against bad actors without jeopardizing their jobs and, in some cases, their personal safety, especially when the prevailing culture and police union posture is overtly the opposite?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think, there's got to be protections for officers that come forth. Secondly, there's got to be, and we included it in the legislation that we put forth. There's got to be responsibility and consequence for failure to intervene. What we saw, and Keith is dealing with the prosecution of other officers. It wasn't just about Derek Chauvin. It was about the other officers that were just there watching. I won't get into I know it's a pending case, so we won't get into too much discussion there, but you don't even have to look at the George Floyd case. You could look at numerous cases throughout the country where there's a failure to intervene. That's part of a policing responsibility to intervene if there's unconstitutional policing going on by way of a partner. Now, I'm not naive to know of the challenges that come with that within particular departments. We've got to navigate through that, but part of it is creating the culture. And again, with stuff like the implementation of consent decree giving, AG's pattern practices authority, being able to engage our legislatures at the state level and at the federal level to put in policies that change this culture, that makes it such that it's not an unusual thing for an officer to intervene or to be able to, testify as the officers testified in the George Floyd prosecution. I think that was one of the most important things of symbolism that came out of that prosecution. It was that the officers who testified with great credibility that is not how we were trained. That is not appropriate policing. It took courage for those officers to do that.
Can I ask just what role does bias play in when it comes to training police officers?
Huge. I've attended procedural justice training at the Chicago Police Training Academy, and I think it's it was an impressive training session that I attended. I think if that is drilled in throughout an officer's career, and the neat thing about that training was that you had officers at all different points of their career brought in together from different parts of the city, and they were being pretty open about some of their biases in the training, which is a way you can really get to confronting the situation is if you let people sort of be honest. If everybody's afraid of saying what they truly feel, then you're not going to enlighten them to their shortcomings.
It's interesting because I think, as police officers, you think tough guys, and then you think, but we need you to be vulnerable when it comes to making sure that we're all communicating with each other, understanding who we are, and protecting these communities. I want to ask this before you jump off, and then, of course, Attorney General Ellison, you're going to have the last half hour here. But I want to ask, what policies, besides a registry of decertified or fired officers, this is a question from the group, what policies besides a registry of decertified or fired officers would the attorneys general like to see police departments enact to reduce the use of excessive force?
Well, again, I reiterate intervention. The reality is, if you have an individual who is the officer that's exercising excessive force, oftentimes they're not the only officer on the scene.
Okay.
And there's a lot of adrenaline that goes into. We've seen footage of different situations. There's an incident where in Chicago where an individual spit on an officer, and I don't know what my reflexive reaction is going to be if somebody spits on me, but it ended up in a pretty violent body slam. The point I'm making is that sometimes an individual officer can have an adrenaline going that puts them in a state of mind where they don't know the extent to which they're going beyond the necessary force. So So in addition to use of force training, changing the use of force training, the intervention is critical, and then there's just the consequence, like I said before. There's also de-escalation training. I want to go beyond there because I want to talk about some of the elements that we're dealing with within the consent decree that touches on this, how CPD in particular, Chicago Police Department in particular, can avoid situations that lead to circumstances where excessive force is utilized. Many of those circumstances, police officers are asked to do a whole lot of things that they ought not be the ones to confront. And so we've got to figure out policies that could be put in place. And there are exigent circumstances often that don't allow for somebody with the appropriate crisis intervention training and mental health training to deal with people with mental health problems. I understand that. You're not always going to have a situation where you can bring a mental health professional to the scene of a dangerous situation. Now, officer has to act, but in the cases where that can take place, it could be helpful to de-escalating situations that otherwise escalate to a place where excessive force is used. One of the policies that we've finally come to some accord with the Chicago Police Department on is foot pursuit policy that encourages circumstances where officers make certain that they have a partner or other officers to help in a circumstance, and instead of being in a situation where you've got the adrenaline going of chasing somebody down and you're by yourself, and then some of those circumstances can lead to unnecessary excessive force. Again, I want to reiterate, I'm not naive about the reality that there are circumstances that call for the use of extreme force that is appropriate to meet the risk that is being put forth to the public or to the officer themselves. So I recognize that, but I think there are circumstances where there are policies that can minimize the possibility of excessive force being used.
The more I listen to you all, the more I do not envy the job that you have to do. I will say, as a journalist, though my heart is broken every day as someone who delivers news, I want to bring in Attorney General Ellison just on the same question. Besides a registry of decertified or fired officers, what policies would you like to see police departments enact to reduce the use of excessive force? Is he muted? Let's see. Maybe. He is on mute. Yes, he's muted. And let me just ask Kwame, while he unmutes, how long do we have you left?
Probably about 8-9 minutes.
About 8 or 9 minutes?
Yeah.
Can I ask you just quickly, because we also have lost the picture for Attorney General Ellison. Can we talk about political actions? This is a question that Noble wanted to put forth. What political actions are needed to support civil and criminal sanctions to pressure police departments into adapting constitutional practices?
Yeah, so I think one of them is the effort that we have ongoing to get the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passed. I did go to my state legislature, to my former colleagues this past January, and ask for patterns and practice investigative authority from the state legislature. I think it's important that Keith and Tish and I and our 47 other colleagues have it at the federal level as well, notwithstanding the fact that the Department of Justice historically has been the one to come into the 50 states with these investigations, as I understand they're coming into Minnesota, and as they did on the heels of the Laquan McDonald murder that led to the consent decree that we're party to implementing. The consent decree is a political process in some ways, because it's unfortunately, it grows out of a court case. So it's adversarial in nature, but it doesn't have to be. I think it can be collaborative. Have I clashed with our mayor at times on this? Absolutely. However, do I believe her history is one of, before she became mayor, advocating for law enforcement reform. And so the nature of being able to initiate patterns and practice investigations the same way DOJ has historically done puts us under the umbrella of a court case that creates the pressure on departments to make some comprehensive change. In addition, I think another area where DOJ can be helpful, as well as other grant-making organizations, is you can do a lot with money, right? And so police departments benefit from grants. To the extent that grant making requires making sure, for instance, that there's an appropriate certification program, the appropriate discipline process within the department or within the state, that the leverage that DOJ or other grant-making entities might have by way of leveraging the dollar can lead to reform within individual departments as well.
Yes, it's not brown, it's not black, it's not white, green.
Yeah.
Possibly makes the biggest difference in our law efforts there. Thank you so much for your time. I know you had to run, but Kwame Raul, the Attorney General there in Illinois, I appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate you for having me and allowing me to share the stage with a great man up there in Minnesota, and my friend Keith Ellison. So I'll leave you with Keith to carry on the show.
Thank you so much. And, Keith, I think about Philando Castile, and again, objective as a journalist, but that was a heartbreaking case. And so that case garnered a lot of attention, but not the attention that we saw, obviously, with George Floyd. It almost took all of the confluence of events to really make this a time for us to have discussions like these. It's such an onion. How do you think that particular case has moved forward fair policing? Uh-oh, I hope you're here. Uh-oh, he's completely dropped off. That's what my notice is saying. I'm going to go ahead. So what this means is we're at an interesting place in this discussion. We have no panelists right now. Hopefully we'll give him just a few minutes to hop back on. And again, if he has not done so by 2:30, we will consider this convened. And I hope that you guys felt like you got a lot of great information from it. I know I did. What I'd like to do, though, is ask you in the next couple of minutes, if you can come up with a question to send us. That would be awesome. If you're able to pull up your chat, that'd be amazing. And again, we'll just give him a couple of minutes to try to get back on. In the meantime, though, if you do have some questions, I would love to hear those. Some of the questions that we have gotten in comments, obviously we talk about, so he's getting some technical assistance right now. That's what we're learning, that Attorney General Ellison is getting some technical assistance right now. We've had questions about social media profiles of officers in cases of excessive force, and whether or not that even factors into decisions after an issue has happened, whether that factors into prosecution when an officer has used excessive force. Also a great reminder in some of the questions that I've been sent here that, hey, police are a part of the communities that they police. They're a part of that, obviously. And as I mentioned, I have a soft heart. There are 3 nephews who are in law enforcement that I pray for every night. But again, as someone who, just like all of you who are watching, want this, want the professionalization, as they said, of law enforcement to continue across the country, not only in these major cities that we're speaking with. So we've got about 2 more minutes that we're going to wait to see if Attorney General Ellison can hop back on. I hope you guys have gotten some really good information here, and not just on this panel, but throughout the entire conference here. We'll give him another minute or so. This is where we need like music, right? The elevator music, it would help. Okay, understand that we have we actually do have someone that we can chat with. Okay, before we let you go, I do want to ask Mr. Jefferson, who I believe is also here on this panel, maybe hidden right now. Mr. Jefferson, please, if you'll come forward. And again, just I want to put that last question about policies, aside from a registry of decertified or fired officers, that attorneys general would like to see police departments enact to reduce the use of force. Mr. Jefferson, your position, please, sir, and your position, not only your title, but your position on that particular question.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. I'm James Jefferson, Sergeant with Louisiana State Police, currently assigned to our Internal Affairs Division. I would respond to that question by saying that it's really, we're not reinventing the wheel, right? If we get back to the basics of policing and what it is that we expect and train our officers around the nation to do, and have leaders in position that will hold these officers accountable, I think that we will achieve the desired outcome. I do agree that we have to evolve with time and continue to grow as a department as it relates to 21st century policing, things of that sort, looking at what's new, what other agencies are doing, possibly around police accountability. But it really gets back to hiring, training, policies, and holding our people accountable. How are we ensuring that we're hiring the best person for the job? That's really where it starts at. And maybe sometime we should put more effort into maybe reevaluating the psychological tests, or are we hiring officers that, although they passed the psychological test, they're borderline on some of the hot topic issues that we often see around the nation. So I would say kind of getting back to the basics, understanding that it's about who we're hiring, policies that we have, and ultimately holding them responsible.
And I know that in Louisiana, I used to live in Shreveport. Louisiana. So I have much love for your state and culture. But again, when we are dealing with, these, you talked about it, kind of they're on the borderline when it comes to the issues, the more fringe issues. And I'm going to go ahead and say it. I mean, politically, and I say that because it seems like that was kind of what was supercharging this kind of tension between police as well as community. Talk to me. Is there a use of a social media profile? I've got Mr. Crawford on as well, popping up here.
So yes, we do here, and I'm gonna love to get Chief Mitch Davis if we can log him in. But yes, we do, and that's part of something that our Internal Affairs Division here with Louisiana State Police that we do. We are the arm and handle of our hiring process. So we do have a in-depth social media check.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes, we can.
I
Yes, we can.
appreciate that, Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Crawford being ready as well. We're going to go ahead and go with Attorney General Ellison because I see him. I see his picture, and I just wanted to go ahead and get you to comment. I'm not sure what time you dropped off, Attorney General Ellison, but the question was, aside from a registry of decertified or fired officers, what would you like to see police departments enact to reduce the use of excessive force?
Well, let me tell you, the first thing you need to do is to engage in a conversation, which really helps get community and police on the same conversation. I mean, I know everybody wants you to just tick off an agenda of things, do these 5 things, and then everything's fine. No, a lot of it has to do with sensibility and feel. I mean, why is it that Black and Latino officers and female officers use excessive force less often than white male officers? That's not just a do this, do this, do this. That's an attitude about how the officer addresses the citizen and how the officer feels about the citizen. And that's, we got to get to the bottom of that. And that's not a quick fix. I think it would be great if Noble could support the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Right now, we're kind of stuck. Well, I'm glad about that.
We fully support it. We've been very involved, Attorney General Ellison, with Senator Booker.
Glad about that, sir.
Yes,
I'm
very involved.
Okay, good, because right now it's stuck.
Yes, I know.
Now, and okay, so you talking, I'll be quiet. Go for it.
No, good. No, you're expert. You go ahead, sir.
No, I'm not expert. I'm just, Lori, should he go or should I go?
You go.
Either way.
Listen,
you go. We want to hear from you.
Attorney General Ellison, we want you to go ahead and go because
I was going to say,
time is short.
Right. So George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, very important piece of legislation, a piece of legislation that will even allow state attorneys general to help enforce DOJ processes. I do think that it is important to have the provisions regarding reforming qualified immunity in there. And I think that it is important to have the registry. But those are just a few things. Me and a guy named John Harrington, who's a Black police officer of many, many, many years. He was the St. Paul police chief. Now he's a commissioner of public safety. He and I convened a group where we talked about all these things, including officer wellness, things like that. But there's got to be a recognition among some folks in law enforcement that the community is not just making stuff. I mean, and I know that you don't have to tell Noble that. Noble knows that. I mean, that's why, again, Chief Arredondo, Black police officer, testified in my case in the State versus Chauvin case. That's why we had other officers testify. But there is a lot of feeling among a lot of, I'll say, white officers that the Black community is really just falsely accusing them of excessive force. How then do you have this situation where, say, in Cleveland, you got two police federations? You got a Black one and a white one. In Minneapolis, you got a Black police federation. What accounts for that? Why is it that we have Black police or officer organizations that do not feel that the mainstream organization reflects their interests? And they're not just talking about job insecurity for police officers. They are talking about community issues as well. And so I think it's important to just really get into a bigger conversation, because I think we all just want to solve this. It's like, tell me the 3 things to do, I'll do them, and then it's over. We have been dealing with this problem since slavery ended and before. And so we're still in the middle of this. And Black officers are always suing their police departments for racial discrimination, including in Minneapolis. Why is that, right? So that's why I say we need a much more robust conversation. And I'll just say, this as well, as you ask me what else to do, I think it's important to recognize that the United States incarcerates more people per capita than any country in the world, and more people in general. I had to step away from the call, but one of my staff told me that somebody asked a question, well, how come, you want to hold police accountable, but not citizens? Citizens in the United States are held accountable. You go to jail in the United States, no question. In the United States, you mess up, you're going to prison, especially if you're Black. I mean, we put Black folks in prison at higher rates, for drug use than whites do, when we know people use drugs at the same rate. Blacks and whites smoke weed at the same rate. Who's going to jail for it? And so for so many, we got a lot of problems with our criminal justice system. Noble and Black police officers are on the forefront of change. I'm very proud of that. I think that you are the bridge between community and mainstream policing. You're the bridge. You may not want to be a bridge, because if you're a bridge, sometimes you get walked on. That's what happens to bridges. But who else can we rely on to help us get into a better understanding with our with the mainstream white law enforcement other than Noble? So with that, I am getting toward my time horizon.
Okay.
But I just want to say, Mr. Crawford, thank you and bless you, sir. I'm very proud of everything you do. Thank you for supporting the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And I'm sorry it's been such a crazy afternoon.
Listen,
pulling me back and forth.
We appreciate your time. We know, again, you've got so much on your plate. The world continues to watch Minnesota and what happens there. So,
Absolutely.
there was a police shooting in the middle of the George Floyd trial.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're in the middle of the trial, and they kill somebody else. So now we've got to prosecute that case. My point is, we would love to not prosecute any police officers. And by the way, I've never prosecuted a police officer in my life. I've only prosecuted criminals. Everyone I've ever prosecuted has been already fired from the force, already fired. And I think it's important to investigate the story of Carrie L. Horn, a Black female police officer who tried to intervene, got punched in the face for her trouble, and then fired. What is the story of this lady? Let's talk about this. Let's talk about Tamir Rice, where the guy who shot him had already been excluded from a force. Let's talk about this. Anyway.
Can I ask you one question? I know you've got to run, but I just want to ask you one question as we end this. The George Floyd case, again, it was a confluence of events, right? Everybody is home because of this pandemic. So the eyes of the world saw this injustice. Do you think that case, as challenging as it was and continues to be, is really, it's been a launching pad for this discussion to happen in more serious ways than we have ever had before?
Now, there's the great sociologist Kenneth Clark. And those of you who are into history will remember he did the Dow study in 1954 case. He did the Dow study. Later on in 1968, he was testified in front of Congress, in front of the Kerner Commission, which was studying civil unrest in America. And he said, look, here's what happens. Since he started in Chicago, 1917, he said, look, we start with some unfortunate incident between white police and Black citizens. That leads to protests, which leads to civil unrest, which leads to commissions, which leads to inaction. And wash, rinse, repeat. Is this an inflection moment? If we make it one, it is. If we insist that it is, it is. But if we could just fall back into the historic pattern, which lets us see riots sparked by Black citizens being mistreated by white police, in 1917, 1935, 1943, 1967, 1990, 1991. Rodney King was 91. You know, on up through Teaneck, New Jersey, Cincinnati, and all these others up until this last summer. Don't forget, when President Obama does 21st century policing, why does he do it? It's on the heels of Ferguson. It's on the heels of Ferguson. Here's the deal. Policing is an extension of white authority in America over Black lives. That is what has been happening. And when I say Black lives, I mean Black police officer lives too. It is the Black police officers who are trying to inject public safety as opposed to do what I say, boy or girl. And that's the difference. I mean, you know, we had some heroic. I mean, and even if you take race out of it, there was a case, and I think it was in Alabama, but I'm not sure, where a woman said, "My husband is suicidal. He wants you guys to shoot him." So he does have a gun, but it's not loaded, officer. It's not loaded. The officer shows up at the scene, and he talks the guy into putting the gun down. The other two officers come up and shoot the suspect in the head. Then the other two officers say, "Hey, you put yourself and us at risk for not killing that guy before we got there." The guy gets fired, ends up suing for $175,000 after being unemployed for 3 years. He's not even doing policing no more. He does what we want people to do. He de-escalates and he gets in trouble. The real question for great officers like Dwayne Crawford and many of those who make up Mabel, and friends of mine like Booker Hodges, John Harrington. I know so many awesome Black cops. I mean, I'm talking about Charlie Adams, others. Just there's just no shortage of them. The real question for them is, how can you uphold the standards that you are trained by the brass to uphold? You uphold those standards, and you do that. How can you do that and still not be ostracized by your fellow officers when you do that? Because if you say, "I'm going to intervene when I see this thumper beating the crap out of somebody," you got to ask yourself, well, first of all, you ain't being invited to the picnic. You ain't going hunting with them on the weekend. You ain't going bowling with them. First of all, you're socially pushed out. But then you got, if you're a police officer, you got to worry about your safety, because you're walking down the alley when actual dangerous people are trying to hurt you. You're hoping somebody's watching your back. Are they? I mean, you know, it is a real problem. We need to get cultural change in these departments. And I know y'all got to go, and I'm actually late for where I go to, but I'll tell you one quick story if I may. Is that okay? Yes or no?
Absolutely.
Okay, so one quick story. So Bob Crow, yes, I'm saying his name, Bob Crow. He was a lieutenant in the Minneapolis Police Department. He was the president of the Minneapolis Police Federation. This guy, now many people know I'm a Muslim, right? I've been a Muslim. I converted to Islam when I was 19 years old. I'm almost 58. So he is training black cops. He's not black cops, cops of all colors. Crow is training cops. He's in a classroom setting with nobody but cops of all colors. He says, well, the people in Minneapolis are pretty dumb. We're at war with the terrorists, and they just elected one of them. So this black female police officer says, are you calling Congressman Ellison a terrorist? He says, well, he is one of them. So they go back and forth. Ain't nobody but cops in the room. She's fighting, standing up for me. I'm very pleased that my friend is doing that. But this racist creep is trying. I mean, look, at the time I was a 40-year-old lawyer and a congressman. I ain't scared of Bob Crow. But what about a 17-year-old Somali kid? Okay, so that's not the end of the story. This dude, I mean, I could keep going on about Bob Crow, but Bob Crow brags about all his use of force complaints, has way more than double digits, and finally he quit. This man is carrying racist attitudes into the police department. Madera Arredondo had to sue him for racial discrimination and won the lawsuit. So, I mean, look, how are we gonna make good officers who want to protect the public safe enough to actually uphold their training? Because once an officer, because you get out of the academy and if you got a racist FTO, they're like, yeah, that's what they told you in there, but now here's how you really act. And you dealing with that, it's tough, man. It's not easy. So that's a real deal conversation needs to happen. How can officers who want to uphold training actually uphold training without feeling like they're in the out crowd in their own department. And with that, I'm unfortunately do have to ask you to excuse me, and I am sorry I have to go.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much.
Alaikum salam.
Attorney General Ellison, thank you, sir, so much for all you do for our country. Thank you.
Thank all of
And-
y'all.
Thank you so much. Dwayne Crawford, I want to go ahead and wrap things up with you, sir.
Yeah, that's what add. Yes, what add was already been discussed. I'll be very brief. But yes, Noble has been very supportive of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Last summer, we were very involved with the House Representatives as they crafted that legislation, and most recently, over the last, I guess now month and a half, been working very closely with Senator Booker and Senator Scott, but basically trying to work with the Senate to get bipartisan support. I do want to. I saw some things that were in the chat future here, and I just want to allude to that real quickly. A key thing that Noble did, so we support the bill last summer, support it again this year. But one thing that I thought was interesting was when our Noble sheriffs came together and also doubled down on both the organizational support, but theirs as Noble sheriffs. And that's why I say this is important. In the particular case of the George Floyd bill, there are other parts of our profession that were not in support of that bill. And by having the members of Noble, who happen to also be sheriffs and also members of those other organizations, lend their voice, I think also gave a different perspective and a needed perspective to the conversation.
I so appreciate you saying that. Thank you so much for saying that. Chief Mitchell Davis, before we go, we just have a few more minutes here.
Okay.
I'd like to ask you to comment, if you will, on one of the questions that we've been getting here, which is how can Black law officers who want to uphold the law, kind of just what the Attorney General was saying there, how can we support the policies of states' attorney generals? And I think Chief Davis is on. If you can go ahead and comment for me, I'd appreciate it.
Want you Davis to speak to it, or me?
Chief Davis, if they would, and I'm going to come back to you.
Okay. So Chief,
but is Chief on?
I don't think he's on.
Okay, I was told we had him on, so I'll go ahead and.
Mitchell Davis, are you on, sir? I don't think he is, but I will allude to the work he's done and others in Illinois. I know that Attorney General Raul probably referenced this, but I think seeing what occurred in the state of Illinois when those communities came together along with the law enforcement community. I'm sorry, he is on, but he cannot be heard. I'm sorry.
Are you muted, Chief Davis? I'm not sure. See if you've got a mute button there.
He says I'm on, but I just want to applaud what the state did. But no number of members from Noble, including Chief Mitchell Davis, were very involved in helping craft that legislation at the state level. And the reason I bring this up, are we at Noble hopeful that the federal level will be able to see federal legislation? Yes, we're hopeful. But at the state and local levels, I think there's a huge opportunity for our Noble members and our law enforcement folks out there to lend your voices at the local level. And this is why I say this. You all as citizens, Noble members or not, have the ability to hold your mayors, your city councils, your county commissioners, elected officials accountable with the kind of reform that you want to see locally. That being said, there was a task force report that was started by President Linda Williams and by our task force members that created a documented roadmap of how local communities can see the kind of policing by reimagining public safety. That is a tool that any of us can use. But yes, Lori, I agree that our members, our law enforcement profession locally, I think can accelerate that process, similar to the state of Illinois, even if we don't get federal legislation to come out of the Senate and the House.
Can you hear me now?
Chief Davis,
yes, we can hear you, sir.
You.
Yes,
I want to go
sir.
ahead and give you the floor there, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, so as Dwayne was saying, as far as Black officers are concerned, the biggest thing is for a couple things. That we have the support, first of all, of like-minded folks within our profession that support us in the things that we do, and for the community. I often tell when sitting on panels that, that can sometimes be a little hostile, that oftentimes people in our community don't realize that they do have Black officers out there that are on that front line fighting for what's right in our communities, and that we need their support because we're faced with it from both ends. We're faced with it from our colleagues, even at the Chiefs level. When George Floyd was murdered, I put out a statement for our Chiefs Association that very next day. I was one of the first people in the country to put one out. And I had members, colleagues that were on my executive board that attacked me, that told me, how dare you put out a statement without asking our permission? My name is on that letterhead, and I'm not, why would you be saying something without asking? So there's things like that that we are faced with that we don't mind, but we can always use support. So those are the things that black officers can actually utilize, both internally from our profession and externally from our communities. But one thing that was mentioned earlier by one of the generals was talking about changing the culture. If we can make all the legislation, all the rules and regulations we want, but if we don't attack the culture that exists within law enforcement aggressively, it'll all be for naught. And one of the things that I am trying to spearhead here in the state of Illinois is that our hiring process, and this was also mentioned earlier. Right now, I'll give you an example. I had a company that did our polygraphs. They called me and told me that we did a polygraph on a person that you're trying to hire, and you shouldn't hire this guy. And I'm like, okay, why shouldn't I hire him? Well, this guy couldn't fight his way out of a paper bag. What do you mean by that? This kid, he's a nerd. Okay, he was in the marching band in college. He's got a degree in science, and he was a nerd, and he just would not make a good police officer. So I asked the guy, I said, okay. I said, well, let me share with you. I went to college as an engineering student. I was a computer programmer for 8 years before I became a police officer. Now, 30 years later, I'm a police chief. So what you're telling me makes no sense. But what it told me was our vetting process for hiring people. I don't need somebody that can fight. I can teach somebody how to protect themselves. I need somebody that can think, that can empathize with the communities that they serve, and that can problem solve. That's what we have to start doing, is changing the metrics by which we're hiring, so that we are hiring the right kind of people, that it's less difficult for us to have to change we don't have to do a bunch of changing of mindsets. If we have people that are walking in the door with mindsets that fit with the current culture that already needs to be changed, we're starting off behind the 8 ball. So it's got to be a multifaceted approach in changing the culture within law enforcement. But if we don't address the culture within law enforcement, we're going to continue to have these folks out there, and they may be in the minority, but they're the ones that are causing the most harm within our organizations and within our communities.
I have to ask you, Chief Davis, an engineer, and police chief, let me ask you, you talk about changing the culture, and, I had a question that came through that said, look, there's good cops, there's bad cops, and then there's those people that just stand by. How do you impact those officers who are maybe just in the middle and stand by to make sure that when a situation comes around that they do stand up?
Great question. So one thing is, and it just took place in the new legislation that General Raul was talking about here in Illinois, is that there are now accountability measures in the legislation for failure to intervene. So you can be held accountable from a legal standpoint for failure to intervene. But I think a lot of people, it's not necessarily, some people may be scared, but we have to put systems in place by which they're not in the minority. So when you look back at what happened to George Floyd, you talk about those 2 new guys. I said one guy had just gotten out of the academy, one guy had only been out a few months, however long they were out. It should not matter. We have to work on a culture that exists by which it doesn't matter if the chief of police has got their knee on somebody's neck, and it seems and it's to an extent where it's excessive force. Everybody has to understand that you're helping somebody out by intervening, both the person that's the victim and the officer. And once again, it was General Raul mentioned earlier that there are times when things happen. People are human. When somebody might snap, and if I'm your friend, I should be able to say, "Hey, man, you need to step back and take a breath." And it's not looked at as being an offensive or an aggressive measure. It's something that's helping you out, it's helping the person out, and it's helping all of us out, because now we're all being held accountable. So that has to come from the top. Leadership has to let the people that are in an organization understand that we got your back. If you come forward, you're not going to be losing your job. From an internal standpoint, we got your back. And for those folks that that whistleblower mentality, the person who's actually offending, I tell folks this, that my people that have worked for me before, I say, hey, if you're doing stuff intentionally out there, I'm not going to throw you in front of the bus. I'm going to hold you down in front of the bus, because I need for everybody to know that I don't condone what you did. So that has to happen from a mentality standpoint for everybody that works in law enforcement, that we got to become protective of our profession, and we want people doing the right thing here. And we as colleagues are going to hold each other accountable.
Chief Mitchell Davis, the first Black president of the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police. I so appreciate your time today. Thank you for contributing to this really important discussion. We only have a few minutes left. So what I'd like to do is, let's see. Wanted to share, CNN just reported that a Capitol police officer who responded to the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol earlier this year has just committed suicide. This is the third officer who has committed suicide since that event. Can we have a moment of silence before we close? I feel as though that's not only appropriate, but
absolutely
extremely important for us to do. And before, if we could just do that, and then Mr. Crawford, I'd like to bring you after we just have one moment of silence.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for that. And thank you for the work that you do. Those who are listening, I'm assuming a lot of law enforcement officers. So I just want to say, as a journalist, I appreciate the job that you do.
Absolutely.
As a citizen of a community, I appreciate the job that you do. Of the mother of a young Black son, I appreciate the work that you do. And I just want you to know there's a whole community, an entire body of people that are behind you. So as we wrap up, Mr. Crawford, I would like to just put this to you as a journalist, right? How can I help to tell the story of the great work that Noble is doing, the great work that our Black officers are doing? What do you need from us to help tell your story?
Well, Lord, first, thank you for the great job you did as a moderator. I know there's been a lot of musical chairs going on. So let me just first thank you and our viewing audience. We have 102 people right now that are
Awesome.
viewing in to this discussion. I think, Lori, a lot of it's access. A lot of times, we at Noble get inundated all kind of media requests. We don't mind responding to them, right? But I think trying to make sure we're talking about facts and truth and making sure that as we talk about this narrative, it isn't as simple as just who a person's skin color or where someone lives or what. This is complex, right? And I think it's trying to balance from a journalism standpoint, what's the focus so much on Washington, D.C. That is important, don't get me wrong. But I also think it's sharing examples where people locally are getting the kinds of reimagining of publics that they want to see in their local community. I'm not saying we should ignore Capitol Hill. It's just that we put everything into the George Floyd, just simply saying, I'm praying for what's going to happen. But if it doesn't happen, or doesn't happen the way that we as citizens want to see, it doesn't mean we still cannot get the changes that we need. Keep this in mind, there are approximately 18,000 law enforcement agencies out there. 18,000. With that being said, we have a great probability of what? Getting the change you want to see locally, even if it doesn't happen at a state or federal level. But no, Lori, it's the access to you and others, asking the tough questions, but I also think being very diverse in who you're getting, both from geography as well as chiefs and sheriffs. The law enforcement is very much a complex a profession, right? You've got people at the state, local, but I think getting multiple diverse voices. And I'm also going to say this too, and holding us accountable. It goes both ways. But yes, access to you and your voices, but also continuing this dialogue. For example, we at NOAA have a program called the Law in Your Community program, a free program. We usually do about maybe 150 events a year. We bring the community and law enforcement together. That's a perfect platform to have these kind of conversations. And we focus on high school and middle school kids, right? Trying to get young people's voices heard and their parents. But that's a perfect example. It's a free program. Doesn't cost the community anything. And we have over 100 trained facilitators that will go into these communities and have these conversations along with the law enforcement community. So we'll talk more about that offline, Lori, but thank you again for being our moderator for this great conversation.
Well, thank you guys so much. With that, it is 3 o'clock, so we will end this session. And I look forward to furthering this discussion in the future.
Absolutely. We'll be in contact. Thank you, everyone.
Great
Thank
points
you,
made. Thank you all so much.
Yep, take care.